New York City, 1930, Stephanie Street. Claire sits before investigators with a problem almost no racketeer in Harlem would willingly create. She is about to tell the government exactly which police officers took her money. She is not a reformer who wandered accidentally into the underworld. She is one of Harlem's most powerful policy bankers, a woman whose illegal lottery business has made her rich, feared, and impossible to ignore. For years, the system has worked through an arrangement everyone understands, but few admit in public. Numbers money moves through Harlem. Protection money moves toward corrupt officers, and the officers are supposed to leave the runners alone. Then the bargain breaks. Police keep taking the money, but arrests continue. Street Clair does something dangerous because it violates the logic of the entire arrangement. She talks. She names names. She tells investigators that she has paid thousands of dollars in graft to men who wear badges and claim to enforce the law. In a city where gamblers can be arrested for slips of paper while officers quietly profit from the same business, Stephanie Street, Claire forces the contradiction into daylight. It is an extraordinary move, not because she has suddenly become respectable, but because she understands that publicity can be a weapon. Harlem already knows her by names that sound almost royal. Madame Street Clair, the Queen of Policy, Madame Queen. She dresses well, lives well, speaks with command, and has built a reputation for a temper sharp enough to make enemies remember her. But the title hides the more important fact. Her power is not ceremonial. It comes from an underground financial machine embedded in Harlem's daily life. From runners who collect small bets, from customers who trust the game, from cash that circulates outside institutions that often exclude black New Yorkers, and from the discipline required to keep the entire network moving. That is why police corruption matters so much. The badges are not simply taking bribes from a gambler, they are taxing an economy. And Street, Claire is now challenging the tax collectors. Her testimony helps expose corruption and contributes to disciplinary action against officers. But the risk is larger than courtrooms or suspensions. Every time Stephanie pushes back, she announces something about herself to Harlem, to the police, and eventually to organized crime beyond the neighborhood. She does not intend to surrender because someone stronger tells her to. That attitude will soon place her in the path of Arthur Dutch Schultz, the Bronx beer baron whose organization is looking for new profits as prohibition begins to lose its future. Schultz will see Harlem's numbers business as money waiting to be absorbed. Stephanie will see the same business as something she built and has no intention of handing over. Between them will come threats, beatings, shattered storefronts, frightened runners, and a struggle over who gets to profit from Harlem. And standing near Stephanie during that struggle will be a younger gangster named Ellsworth Johnson. History will remember him by another name, Bumpy. Decades later, Bumpy Johnson will become the dominant popular image of Harlem's underworld, portrayed in books, films, and television as the neighborhood's enduring criminal king. But that image can make the timeline feel backward. Before Bumpy became the legend, Stephanie Street, Claire was already wealthy, already politically troublesome, already operating a major numbers business, and already willing to confront forces most gamblers preferred to pay. He did not enter an empty Harlem and create power from nothing. He entered a world where Madame Street Clair had already built a throne worth fighting over. That is the story hidden behind the familiar name. Not simply how Bumpy Johnson rose, or how Dutch Schultz invaded Harlem, but how a Caribbean immigrant woman became powerful enough that both men eventually became part of her story. And before we can understand why they came for her business, we have to understand how Stephanie Street Clair created it in the first place. Stephanie Street Clair understood something about power long before Harlem learned her name. If the world insists on defining you, sometimes the first act of survival is defining yourself. The difficulty for historians is that even the beginning of her life is wrapped in uncertainty, different records, later recollections, and Street. Claire's own statements do not always agree on exactly when she was born, precisely where in the French Caribbean she came from, or the route that eventually brought her to the United States. Some accounts place her origins in Guadeloupe, others connect her to Martinique or France, and even her birth year has been disputed. That uncertainty is not a minor footnote. It tells us something important about the woman she became. Stephanie Street. Clair lived in an era when immigrant women, especially black women from the Caribbean, were constantly being categorized by race, nationality, class, and gender. She appears to have responded by constructing an identity strong enough to resist other people's definitions. She spoke French, carried herself with an air of education and refinement, and later cultivated a public image that made her seem less like a street gambler and more like a woman of position. By the time she emerged in Harlem, she was not simply Stephanie. She was Madame Street Clair. The title mattered. Harlem, in the early 20th century, was becoming one of the most important centers of black political, cultural, and economic life in the United States. The Great Migration was reshaping New York. Black Southerners arrived alongside immigrants from the Caribbean, creating a neighborhood filled with ambition but also boxed in by discrimination. White landlords, employers, banks, police, and political machines all influenced who could live where, who could get credit, who could open a business, and who could expect protection from the law. Harlem was becoming famous for music, literature, nightlife, churches, newspapers, political organizations, and black entrepreneurship. It was also becoming a place where underground businesses could thrive because legal opportunity and economic demand did not always meet. Street Clair arrived in this world as an outsider, even within an outsider community. Caribbean immigrants could face tension with black Americans, as well as racism from the wider city. For a woman trying to build independence, the legal pathways were narrower still. Yet there is no reliable evidence that poverty alone somehow pushed Stephanie mechanically into crime. That explanation would be too simple. What matters is that she recognized opportunity. She learned the rhythms of Harlem, understood how money moved through the neighborhood, and saw that one particular business combined mathematics, trust, street organization, and enormous demand. The numbers game was technically illegal gambling, but to its customers it could feel almost ordinary. A worker could risk a few cents. A domestic servant could make a small bet. A laborer could choose a number before work and wait for the result. The dream was modest enough to repeat every day, and that repetition created an extraordinary flow of cash. Street. Clair did not invent policy gambling in Harlem, and she was not the only major banker operating there. Men such as Casper Holstein became enormously important in the same world. But Stephanie did something remarkable. She established herself as a serious operator in a business dominated by men, and did it loudly enough that her name became part of Harlem folklore. Later stories would describe her as arriving in America with money already in hand, or saving a small fortune before entering the racket. But the exact origin of her startup capital remains uncertain. What is clearer is what happened after she gained a foothold. She began building a network. Runners collected bets. Employees moved slips and cash. Winning numbers were determined according to systems customers believed were difficult for bankers to manipulate. A successful banker needed liquidity to pay winners, discipline to prevent theft, protection against robbery, relationships with street operators, and enough credibility that bettors believed a winning ticket would actually be honored. Stephanie possessed the personality for that environment. She could be generous, combative, theatrical, calculating, and fiercely protective of her position. The image of Madam Queen was not separate from the business. It helped secure it. In a world where reputation reduced the number of people willing to cheat you, identity had economic value. Street. Clair had crossed an ocean and entered a city that offered her no guaranteed authority. Harlem did not hand her a throne. She constructed one out of cash, organization, nerve, and a name people remembered. And once that name began producing real money, the numbers game stopped being merely a neighborhood hustle. It became an enterprise valuable enough for corrupt police, rival bankers, and eventually some of New York's most dangerous gangsters to start calculating what Stephanie Street Clair was worth. To understand how Stephanie Street Clair became rich enough to challenge police officers, survive rival gangsters, and eventually attract the attention of Dutch Schultz. You have to understand the machine beneath the nickname. Harlem's numbers game looked simple from the sidewalk. A customer chose a 3-digit number, placed a small bet with a runner, and waited for the day's result. But behind that tiny wager was an organization that functioned more like an underground financial network than a casual street hustle. At the bottom were the players, thousands of ordinary people risking pennies, nickels, dimes, or whatever they could spare. Above them were runners who moved through apartment buildings, barber shops, restaurants, workplaces, street corners, and neighborhood businesses collecting bets. Those runners delivered money and betting slips to collection points where clerks and managers kept track of the action. At the top sat the banker. The banker was the person carrying the real financial risk. If too many customers selected the winning number, the banker had to produce the cash. If runners disappeared with receipts, the banker absorbed the loss. If police raided an office, the banker needed lawyers, replacement employees, and enough reserves to keep the operation alive. A numbers banker, therefore, needed more than muscle. The business required capital, bookkeeping, trust, discipline, and a network large enough to generate steady volume without exposing the entire organization through one vulnerable location, Stephanie Street. Clair became one of the people capable of managing that system. She did not invent numbers gambling, and she did not control every policy operation in Harlem. Other major bankers, including Casper Holstein, built powerful organizations of their own. But Clair established herself strongly enough that newspapers, police, competitors, and customers all recognized her as a serious force. The attraction of the game was partly mathematical and partly emotional. The wager was cheap enough that almost anyone could participate, yet the possible payoff was large enough to create hope. For black residents who faced discrimination from mainstream banks and limited access to many forms of investment or credit, the numbers economy also circulated money inside the neighborhood in ways that legal institutions often did not. That did not make the racket charitable or harmless. Customers lost far more often than they won, and the profits enriched bankers. But the business was woven into everyday life, which made it harder to eradicate and easier to defend as something belonging to Harlem rather than to outsiders. The winning number itself was often tied to published financial figures or other publicly available totals, creating the appearance that no individual banker could simply invent the result after bets had been placed. That perception mattered. A customer had to believe the game was illegal but not fraudulent. A banker who refused to pay legitimate winners could destroy a reputation faster than police ever could. Clair understood that reputation was part of the balance sheet. She became known for paying, for protecting her operation, and for responding aggressively when people threatened her money. As the organization expanded, the profits allowed her to live far beyond what most black women in New York could realistically expect from conventional employment in the 1920s. Contemporary accounts and later histories describe her accumulating substantial wealth from policy banking, although exact income and fortune estimates vary widely and should be treated cautiously. What matters is not one spectacular number, but the visible evidence of economic ascent. She could afford expensive clothing, legal representation, employees, political attention, and eventually residence at 409 Edgecombe Avenue, one of Harlem's most prestigious addresses, a building associated with prominent black professionals, artists, intellectuals, and public figures. That created a striking contradiction. Stephanie Street Clair was earning illegal money inside a segregated economy, then using some of that money to enter spaces associated with black achievement and respectability. She was not the only policy banker to blur that boundary. Harlem's gambling economy could finance businesses, jobs, loans, charitable gifts, political causes, and community institutions, even while remaining criminal. The line between underworld power and neighborhood influence was therefore less clean than outsiders sometimes imagined. A successful banker could employ people who had few attractive legal opportunities. A banker could help a tenant, support a business, pay a lawyer, donate to a cause, or use cash to cultivate loyalty. Every favor expanded the social network, protecting the organization. Every employee created another household with an economic interest in the game continuing. Every customer who trusted the operation strengthened its legitimacy at street level. That was the deeper source of Stephanie's power. She was not simply sitting in a room collecting bets. She occupied the top of a system connecting money, labor, information, protection, and reputation. The same structure that made her wealthy also made her vulnerable. Runners could be arrested. Police could demand payments. Rivals could poach territory. Employees could be intimidated. Politicians could promise protection and withdraw it. And once outsiders realized how much cash moved through Harlem every day, the business began to look less like a neighborhood lottery and more like an industry waiting to be conquered. Stephanie could defend herself against individual thieves. She could replace a runner. She could hire lawyers. She could even pay corrupt officers when that was the price of operating. What she could not control was the growing appetite of institutions around her. The police saw revenue. Politicians saw leverage. Rival bankers saw customers. And organized crime figures outside Harlem increasingly saw a cash business with enormous demand, low production costs, and no legal corporation capable of calling the authorities when someone tried to take it. Stephanie sank. Clair had built a machine that worked because thousands of people trusted it. Now the success of that machine was creating the danger that would define the rest of her life. By the time Stephanie Street Clair moved into 409 Edgecombe Avenue, she had achieved something that would have seemed almost impossible for a black immigrant woman in New York only a few years earlier. The building was not merely expensive real estate. It was one of Harlem's most prestigious addresses, home over time to prominent black professionals, artists, musicians, activists, and intellectuals. Living there announced that Stephanie had money, status, and confidence. Yet the source of that status created a contradiction she never tried very hard to hide. Her wealth came from an illegal lottery, but she increasingly presented herself as a public figure with opinions about politics, race, policing, and the treatment of black residents by the city. This was where Madam Street Clair became something more complicated than a successful numbers banker. Most racketeers understood that survival depended on silence. Pay the right officer, avoid unnecessary publicity, keep the money moving, and never invite investigators to look too closely. Stephanie repeatedly broke that rule. She used Harlem newspapers to communicate directly with the public, placing notices and advertisements under her own name, sometimes criticizing authorities and sometimes warning residents about their legal rights. The press gave her a weapon that guns could not. A police officer could arrest a runner on a corner. He could seize betting slips. He could threaten employees. But once corruption appeared in print, it entered a different battlefield, one where the department had to worry about politicians, investigators, reformers, and public embarrassment. Stephanie understood the leverage. Her relationship with the police was never simple. Numbers operators could not function openly without some degree of protection, and protection in New York's underground economy often meant bribery. Money moved upward from gambling operations toward officers who were expected to ignore certain activity or provide warning before raids. But corrupt arrangements were unstable because the person taking the bribe always possessed another source of profit, the ability to demand more. A banker could pay for protection and still see runners arrested. An officer could collect from competing operations at the same time. A new commander could change the price overnight. A politician could suddenly decide that reform was useful. For Stephanie, the system became intolerable when police officers appeared willing to take gambling money without reliably providing the protection they were being paid for. She responded not by disappearing, but by escalating the confrontation. In 1930, authorities convicted Street Clair on gambling-related charges, and she spent months incarcerated. For many criminal operators, that would have been a warning to become quieter. Stephanie emerged, prepared to become louder. She cooperated with investigators examining police and judicial corruption and described payments she said had been made to officers. Her allegations contributed to disciplinary action against members of the police department, including the suspension of officers connected to the corruption investigation. The exact significance of each accusation should not be exaggerated, but the larger meaning is clear. A black woman who had made her fortune through an illegal business was publicly helping expose the men who had profited from policing that same business. That was an extraordinary inversion of power. Stephanie did not suddenly become an opponent of gambling. She continued to defend her own interests, nor did speaking about corruption transform her into a conventional civic reformer. She remained a racketeer protecting a criminal enterprise. But she understood that the law was not operating neutrally in Harlem. Officers could arrest poor bettors and runners while taking money from the bankers above them. Respectable institutions could condemn the numbers game while benefiting indirectly from the cash and political relationships surrounding it. Stephanie's public attacks exploited that hypocrisy. She also used her newspaper presence to advise black residents about encounters with police, encouraging them to understand that an arrest did not erase their rights. That activism helped build an image far different from the silent gangster stereotype. To some Harlemites, she could appear simultaneously as lawbreaker and defender, employer and exploiter, criminal boss and woman willing to challenge corrupt authority when others were afraid to do so. Those contradictions made her harder to categorize and helped strengthen the mythology around Madame Queen. But publicity carried a cost. Every newspaper notice increased her visibility. Every accusation created another enemy. Every successful confrontation reinforced her belief that aggressive resistance could protect what she had built. And while Stephanie was fighting police corruption, the economics of New York crime were changing around her. Prohibition had created enormous fortunes for bootleggers during the 1920s, but the political future of alcohol prohibition was becoming uncertain. Gangsters who had invested in beer, liquor, trucks, warehouses, speakeasies, and political protection could see that the market would not remain untouched forever. They needed other sources of dependable cash. Harlem's numbers game offered exactly that. There was no expensive product to manufacture, no shipment of whiskey to hijack, and no legal corporation capable of asking a court to protect its market share. The customers were already there. The runners were already there. The bankers had already built the distribution networks. An outsider did not need to invent the business. He only needed to take control of the people who were already making it profitable. That realization would soon bring one of New York's most feared gangsters toward Harlem. Stephanie had already shown that crooked police could not easily intimidate her. Now she was about to discover that confronting individual officers was very different from confronting an organization prepared to use systematic violence to absorb an entire market. The man who would later become known as Bumpy Johnson entered Stephanie Street Clair's story before he became the figure Harlem mythology remembers. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, and at this stage he was not yet the independent underworld power later portrayed in books, films, and television. He was a younger street operator with a growing reputation for toughness, intelligence, and an ability to navigate violence without losing sight of business, street. Clair already had something he did not, an established numbers organization. Money, employees, neighborhood recognition, and years of experience dealing with police, politicians, competitors, and the risks of running an illegal enterprise in Harlem. Their relationship is often simplified into a neat origin legend in which Stephanie somehow creates Bumpy Johnson from nothing. The historical reality is less cinematic and more useful. Bumpy brought his own abilities, connections, and ambitions. Stephanie provided access to a functioning criminal system where those abilities could become more valuable. He worked as one of her trusted associates and helped protect an organization that increasingly needed enforcement as competition intensified. That distinction matters because it reverses the way the story is usually remembered. Today, Bumpy Johnson is often placed at the center of Harlem's criminal history, with earlier figures treated as background. In the early 1930s, the hierarchy looked different. Stephanie Street Clair was the established banker. Bumpy was part of her orbit. The arrangement also reveals how a numbers operation actually defended itself. Cash alone could not protect runners from robbery. Reputation alone could not stop rival operators from taking territory. Newspaper advertisements could embarrass police, but they could not physically prevent an enemy crew from intimidating shopkeepers or destroying a betting location. A banker, therefore, needed people capable of applying pressure when negotiation failed. Bumpy fit that role. He was useful not simply because he could fight, but because successful enforcement required judgment. Too little force invited predators. Too much force brought police attention, frightened customers, and created enemies faster than the business could absorb them. The ideal enforcer understood that violence was supposed to defend revenue, not replace it. Stephanie's organization gave Bumpy a front-row education in that balance. He could watch how policy money moved through Harlem, how alliances were maintained, how corrupt officials were handled, how neighborhood loyalty could become economic protection, and how criminal authority depended on more than the willingness to shoot someone. At the same time, Stephanie benefited from having men around her who could make resistance credible. Her public persona was unusually visible for a racketeer. She challenged police and newspapers, criticized corruption, and made statements that could not be taken back once printed. Visibility strengthened her standing, but it also meant that threats against her could not be answered only with silence. If Madam Queen publicly declared that Harlem's policy game would not be surrendered, the organization behind that declaration had to be capable of making the warning mean something. Bumpy and other associates became part of that muscle. The partnership should not be romanticized. This was a criminal business, and the same enforcement that protected Street Clair's interests could involve intimidation and violence against competitors. But it was also a relationship between two very different kinds of power. Stephanie understood finance, publicity, organization, and the political value of making herself visible. Bumpy was developing the street authority and underworld flexibility that would later define his own career. For a time, their interests aligned. Then the scale of the threat changed. Stephanie had spent years dealing with crooked cops and rival black policy bankers operating inside the same general economic world. The next opponent came from a much larger criminal ecosystem. Arthur Fliegenheimer, better known as Dutch Schultz, had built his reputation in bootlegging and organized violence. His crews had money, political connections, lawyers, gunmen, and experience taking over profitable rackets. As the future of prohibition weakened and alcohol profits became less secure, gambling looked increasingly attractive. The product could not spoil. There were no trucks full of whiskey to seize. There was no factory that needed to be built. Harlem already contained the customers, runners, collection points, and bankers. Schultz did not need to create demand. He only needed to place himself above the people already profiting from it. That made Stephanie's business vulnerable in a way it had never been before. A corrupt officer might demand a bribe. A local competitor might steal customers. Schultz represented something closer to acquisition by force. His message to policy bankers was simple, in principle. Surrender control. Pay for the privilege of continuing to operate, or face consequences. Some operators calculated that survival required compromise. Stephanie Street Clair calculated differently. She had spent years building a reputation around refusing to be bullied, and now that reputation became a trap as much as an asset. Backing down might save money and lives, but it would also destroy the authority on which her organization depended. Fighting could preserve that authority, but only if she survived. Bumpy Johnson was about to discover the same reality beside her. The next phase of his career would not begin with him ruling Harlem. It would begin with him helping Stephanie Street. Clair defend it from Dutch Schultz. Dutch Schultz did not need Harlem to invent a new market for him. He needed Harlem to surrender one that already existed. By the early 1930s, Schultz had become one of New York's most notorious racketeers, a bootlegger whose organization had grown rich under Prohibition and whose power rested on money, political protection, intimidation, and men willing to kill. But the economics that had created fortunes in illegal alcohol were changing. The Depression squeezed customers. Federal pressure remained relentless, and the political future of prohibition looked increasingly uncertain. Numbers gambling offered something different. The demand was already established. The bets were small enough to survive hard times. The product required no brewery or warehouse full of contraband, and Harlem's black bankers had already built the labor network needed to collect money every day. To men like Schultz, the opportunity was obvious. The difficult part was that the business already belonged to someone else. Harlem contained numerous policy bankers, not one unified criminal government, and that fragmentation made them vulnerable. Schultz could approach operators individually, applying pressure until each calculated that paying him was safer than resisting him. Some surrendered percentages. Others lost routes through threats, debt, coercion, or violence. Once enough bankers accepted outside control, every remaining holdout became more isolated. Stephanie Street Clair refused to accept that future quietly. Her resistance was partly economic and partly personal. The numbers game was the foundation of her wealth, but it was also the source of the authority she had spent years constructing. To hand Schultz a share simply because his organization possessed more guns would mean acknowledging that the title Madam Queen existed only until a white gangster decided otherwise. Stephanie responded using the weapons she understood best: organization, publicity, economic pressure, and, when necessary, force. She encouraged Harlem bettors to keep their money with black policy operators rather than businesses tied to Schultz. She tried to rally smaller black bankers against outside takeover. Accounts of the conflict describe her and her allies confronting white-owned shops that served as betting locations for Schultz, destroying policy slips and, in some cases, smashing property to make participation in his network expensive. The strategy was simple. Schultz needed storefronts, runners, customers, and cooperation inside Harlem. If Stephanie could make those relationships dangerous, his superior resources might not automatically produce control, but Schultz could escalate in ways she could not easily match. His organization threatened employees and targeted people associated with resistant bankers. Men connected to Street Clair were assaulted, kidnapped, and killed during the broader struggle surrounding control of the numbers business. Schultz's pressure was reinforced by another advantage: connections to officials and corrupt elements of the political system. Stephanie had already demonstrated that police protection could be purchased, and that purchased protection could be withdrawn. Schultz operated on a scale where those relationships could become a weapon against competitors. A raid against one banker and tolerance toward another could change the economics of an entire route without Schultz firing a shot himself. That is what made the invasion more dangerous than a conventional gang feud. Stephanie was not simply fighting gunmen. She was fighting a network capable of combining street violence with corruption, money, and political leverage. Bumpy Johnson and the men around her could retaliate at street level, but they could not erase the structural advantage Schultz possessed. The conflict became increasingly personal. Threats reached Stephanie directly. According to later accounts, Schultz put a contract on her life, forcing a woman famous for confronting enemies publicly to disappear temporarily. She later recalled surviving one period of danger by hiding in a cellar while a building superintendent concealed her beneath coal. The image captures the reversal. This was the woman who lived at 409 Edgecombe Avenue, who placed advertisements under her own name, who confronted police corruption, and who cultivated the image of a queen. Now survival meant becoming invisible beneath black dust while gunmen searched for her. Yet even that did not produce immediate surrender. Her refusal gave the conflict symbolic meaning beyond the profits of individual numbers banks. To many in Harlem, Schultz represented an outside criminal force, attempting to seize a profitable black-controlled enterprise. Once white organized crime finally recognized how valuable it had become. Stephanie understood that symbolism and used it. Her public appeals framed betting with black operators as a question of keeping money and power inside the community. That argument did not make policy banking legal, fair, or benevolent. but it transformed a commercial dispute into something larger. Every dollar wagered through a Schultz-connected operation could be presented as another piece of Harlem's underground economy leaving Harlem. The irony was that Stephanie was defending an illegal business by invoking community ownership, while Schultz was attempting to industrialize that same illegal business with methods that resembled corporate consolidation. One side had built local networks through reputation and neighborhood relationships. The other could impose economies of scale through capital, political influence, and organized violence. Over time, that imbalance began to show. The old generation of black policy kings and queens could resist, but resistance became increasingly expensive. Street Clair later claimed that the struggle cost her extraordinary amounts of money and hundreds of days of freedom. Exact figures attached to those recollections are difficult to verify, but the direction of the story is unmistakable. Her position weakened. Black control of the racket contracted. Schultz's influence expanded. Even surviving the violence did not mean preserving the business she had once commanded. And Bumpy Johnson, standing inside that collapsing order, was learning a lesson that would shape his own future. Sometimes survival in organized crime depended less on defeating a stronger system than on finding a place inside the system that replaced yours. By 1935, Stephanie could no longer pretend that determination alone would restore the old balance of power. Schultz had succeeded in penetrating the Harlem numbers economy, and the independent world that had produced figures such as Street Clair and Casper Holstein was being transformed. It appeared that Dutch Schultz had won the larger contest. Stephanie was alive, but the throne she had defended was slipping away. Then Schultz made a mistake that had nothing to do with Harlem. Under relentless prosecution from Special Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey, he began pushing for a solution so extreme that even other major underworld leaders considered him dangerous. Stephanie Street. Clair had been unable to destroy Dutch Schultz. But Schultz was about to create enemies, powerful enough to do it for her. Dutch Schultz's death did not come because Stephanie Street Clair finally found a way to defeat him. It came because Schultz had made himself dangerous to men whose power extended far beyond Harlem. By 1935, Special Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey had become one of the most serious legal threats Schultz had ever faced. Schultz wanted Dewey eliminated. Other organized crime leaders reportedly understood the risk immediately. Killing a prominent prosecutor could trigger a level of political and law enforcement retaliation that threatened everyone, not just Schultz. The problem was no longer whether Schultz could survive another prosecution. The problem was that his response to prosecution might endanger the larger criminal system around him. In October 1935, Schultz was shot at the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey. He lingered 4 hours before dying. For Stephanie Street Clair, the moment was more than the death of a rival. It offered a final chance to speak to the man who had tried to crush her business and force her out of Harlem. According to the story that became part of Street Clair legend, she sent Schultz a telegram while he lay dying. Its message was brutally simple. As ye sow, so shall ye reap. Whether remembered as revenge, theater, or both. The telegram fit Stephanie perfectly. She had always understood the power of making an enemy's defeat public. She could not claim responsibility for Schultz's assassination, and the evidence does not support portraying her as the force behind the killing. But she could claim the symbolism. The man who had threatened her, penetrated Harlem's numbers economy, and reportedly placed her life in danger was dying before she was. For a brief moment, it looked like the story had returned to the logic of Madame Queen. She had resisted. Schultz had fallen. She remained standing. But that apparent victory concealed a deeper defeat. The criminal structure Schultz represented did not disappear with him. White organized crime had already discovered the scale and reliability of Harlem's numbers business. The market had become too valuable to return neatly to the independent world that had existed before outside syndicates pushed in. Schultz was gone, but the economic lesson he had learned remained. Numbers gambling could be taxed, partnered with, absorbed, and incorporated into broader networks of organized crime. And Bumpy Johnson was better positioned than Stephanie to survive that new arrangement. This is where the familiar Harlem underworld story begins to turn away from her. Bumpy had spent years close enough to Street, Clair to understand the neighborhood's gambling economy, and tough enough to function in violent disputes, but his real advantage was adaptability. He could negotiate with forces Stephanie had spent years resisting. Later accounts would describe Bumpy as becoming an intermediary between Harlem's gambling interests and larger mafia power, particularly through relationships associated with New York's Italian-American underworld. The precise mechanics of every arrangement are difficult to reconstruct, and later gangster mythology often makes the transition look cleaner than it was. What matters is the direction of power. Stephanie's model depended heavily on independent control. Bumpy's future depended increasingly on accommodation, brokerage, and the ability to operate within a larger criminal order without disappearing inside it. That difference changed who could thrive after the Schultz era. Street. Clair had built her reputation by refusing humiliation. She had confronted police, challenged corruption, rejected outside pressure, and transformed public defiance into part of her business identity. But the qualities that made her extraordinary also made compromise more difficult. Bumpy did not need to reproduce her style. He needed to inherit enough of the environment she had helped shape while building relationships suitable for the new one. Over time, his name became increasingly associated with Harlem's underworld, while hers moved toward the margins of popular memory. This is the irony at the center of Stephanie Street Clair's story. She survived one of the most dangerous gangsters in New York, but survival did not guarantee control. She outlived Dutch Schultz, but she could not force the criminal economy to become what it had been before he arrived. She had proven that Harlem's numbers bankers could resist invasion, yet the long-term structure of power still shifted toward alliances larger than any one local banker could command. The throne did not simply pass from one ruler to another in a ceremony. It changed shape. By the time Bumpy Johnson emerged as the name later generations would remember, the world around that throne was different from the one Stephanie had built. That is why the phrase "before Bumpy" matters. It is not a marketing trick. It corrects the timeline. Before Bumpy Johnson became the symbol of Harlem's criminal power, Stephanie Street Clair had already demonstrated that such power could be built, defended, politicized, and made visible. Schultz's death gave her the last word against an enemy. History, however, would give the larger legend to someone else. After Dutch Schultz was gone, Stephanie Street Clair did not suddenly recover the Harlem she had once dominated. The numbers business had changed, the balance of criminal power had changed, and the younger man who had once worked within her organization was becoming better suited to the new order. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson would eventually become the name most Americans associated with Harlem's underworld, while Stephanie gradually moved away from the center of the racket. That transition was not a clean coronation, and there is no reliable evidence that she simply handed Bumpy an intact criminal empire. Harlem's gambling economy remained fragmented, competitive, and increasingly connected to larger organized crime networks. But Bumpy's ability to negotiate across those networks helped him build the reputation that later eclipsed hers. Stephanie's own life moved in a different direction. In the late 1930s, she became involved with Sufi Abdul Hamid, a flamboyant Harlem labor activist and religious leader known for organizing campaigns against businesses that refused to hire black workers. Their relationship brought together two personalities accustomed to publicity, confrontation, and control. It also became deeply unstable. In 1938, Street Clair shot Hamid during a domestic dispute. He survived, and Stephanie was convicted for the shooting and sent to prison. The episode damaged the public image she had spent years constructing. This was no longer Madame Queen confronting corrupt police or resisting Dutch Schultz. It was a personal act of violence that could not be reframed as protection of Harlem's economy or resistance to outside power. After her release, she never returned to the same position she had occupied during the height of the numbers era. She lived for decades after the men who had made her famous as an underworld figure began disappearing. Dutch Schultz was dead. Bumpy Johnson would die in 1968. Stephanie Street Clair lived until 1969. Yet by then, public memory was already reorganizing the story. Bumpy became the more recognizable legend because his career fit the mythology American audiences understood. The Harlem gangster who negotiated with the mafia, survived prison, commanded respect, and became a symbol of neighborhood power. Stephanie was harder to package. She was a Caribbean immigrant in a Black American underworld story, a woman operating in a male-dominated criminal economy, a racketeer who also publicly attacked police corruption, a community figure who could advocate legal rights while profiting from illegal gambling. She did not fit neatly into the categories of gangster, activist, entrepreneur, or victim, because she contained elements of all four without belonging completely to any of them. Popular culture reflected that imbalance. Bumpy Johnson became a recurring character in films, books, and later television dramas, while Stephanie often appeared as a supporting figure, a curiosity, or the woman who came before him. Even when fictionalized versions of Harlem's underworld returned to her era, the story was frequently told through male succession, male violence, and male alliances. That framing makes Stephanie Street Clair look like a prelude. Historically, she was part of the foundation. She helped demonstrate how profitable Harlem's numbers economy could become, how neighborhood loyalty could protect an illegal business, how publicity could be used against corrupt officials, and how black-controlled criminal enterprises could become targets once larger syndicates recognized their value. None of that requires turning her into a hero. Her fortune came from illegal gambling. Her organization depended on intimidation and criminal enforcement. She could be combative, ruthless, and violent. The same woman who challenged police corruption also participated in a system that profited from people repeatedly wagering money they were likely to lose. The point is not to sanitize Stephanie Street Clair. It is to place her back where the chronology puts her. Before Dutch Schultz tried to absorb Harlem's policy business, she was already powerful enough to resist him. Before Bumpy Johnson became the neighborhood's most famous underworld name, he operated in a world where she had already established money, organization, and authority. And before American crime mythology turned Harlem into a story of kings and godfathers, one of its most formidable figures was already calling herself Madam Queen. Bumpy Johnson became the legend history remembered. Stephanie Street Clair was one of the people who made that legend possible. To understand Harlem before Bumpy ruled it, you have to begin with the woman who refused to surrender it.